Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Come in, pull up a chair, grab yourself something to drink. Welcome to this latest Pop Conversation with a very special guest. My name is Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director of Popular Conservatism. If you're joining us live, then you can ask us some questions. If you're not joining us live and watching us on catch-up, make sure you join us live last time. You can sign up at popularconservatism.com. Our real special guest this evening, a repeat guest, so we didn't scare him off last time, is Robert Jenrick. Rob is the Conservative Member of Parliament for Newark and the Shadow Justice Secretary. During the previous government, he served, amongst other roles, as Secretary of State for Housing and, of course, as Immigration Minister, a position from which he resigned in opposition to the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's migration policies. He was the runner-up in the 2024 Conservative leadership race, and since then, I think it's fair to say he's become the most proactive, successful and effective campaigner of any MP on the opposition benches, most recently, of course, confronting fare dodgers on the tube, sort of Batman-like, in order to enforce justice. He is fresh off the Three Peaks Challenge. If you don't know what the Three Peaks Challenge is, that is scaling Ben Nevis, Snowdon and Scafell Pike in under 24 hours. I'm told he did it with 10 minutes to spare. So I'm going to ask him a little bit about whether the Tories have got a greater mountain to climb than the three he managed to do in 24 hours. Rob, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
Let's start with the kind of state of play of British politics at the moment then. And look, I don't know if you know, but a lot of our audience will know. I'm a devout supporter of Southampton Football Club. It has been a brutal and disappointing 12 months being a Southampton FC fan. But if anything, it's been an even more brutal and disappointing 12 months being a member of the Conservative Party, right? So we're now approaching the first anniversary of the general election. We get a real shellacking in that election. Fortunately, some good folks such as yourself managed to get back into Parliament. But sort of since then, if anything, there's been a further drift downwards, one fears, if you believe the opinion polls, or the local elections were disappointing. What do you think went wrong for us on July the 4th? I guess that's the easy question. We all knew we were going to lose badly. But more importantly, why do you think we haven't been able to bounce back since?
Well, good question, and it's the question on everyone's lips, really, within the Tory party right now. Can the party be turned around? And to answer that, you've got to look back, as you have, to why we lost the general election and why we lost so badly. And it was our worst ever election defeat. And to me, whilst there are many different causes, the changes of leaders, the lack of professionalism, the disunity, at the heart of it was a very simple thing. We didn't do what we said we were going to do. We didn't deliver for the British public on the most important things facing our country. Open borders, high taxes, a big state that kept on failing rather than a small state that actually worked. An NHS, frankly, that wasn't good enough. We treated it like a religion rather than a public service that needed to be reformed. And it left people feeling very angry and frustrated. And the country that we ultimately bequeathed is broken. It's in a mess, isn't it, right now? You've got stagnating living standards. Mm-hmm. You do have poor public services. You continue to have far too many people coming into our country than should be, both legally and certainly illegally, and many other challenges as well. And that's created a deep sense of discontent in the country. The public voted for change, but they're not getting it under Labour. Now, Keir Starmer might be a good man, but he is fundamentally ill-suited to the challenge the country faces right now. It is not a time for tinkering. You need radical reform to try to arrest economic and societal decline and put the country on a firmer footing. And I think that can be done. I do think there is optimism, or cause for optimism. I think we can turn this country around. But it's not going to be fast. It's not going to be easy that people turn back to the Conservative Party. We've got to work extremely hard to regain people's trust and confidence and to demonstrate that we have changed. And whatever we have done over the course of the last 12 months is clearly not enough. We've not proven to the public, shown, rather than just said it. We've got to show that we've learnt our lessons, we understand what we got wrong, and why that happened, and that we are a different Conservative Party to the one that we've had in recent years. That is the absolute heart of what the party's got to do. And whilst we've made some progress in that journey, we've got to go much, much further and do it quickly. And I think the other thing I'd say is we're living in a very competitive political environment right now. For the first time in my lifetime, there is competition on the right. And so those voices who said, take your time, work sequentially, whilst they might be reasonable offers of advice from the 1970s or from the age post-1997, it just doesn't work for the political environment we're in today. You've got to be active, you've got to be street fighters, you've got to hustle, you've got to work every single day to fight Labour, demonstrate that we are the best opposition that is available, and demonstrate to the public that we have the hunger and the determination to turn the ship around and to regain their trust and confidence. If we don't do that, we risk creating vacuums into which other people step.
So do you think on that, Rob, that what's needed is, I don't believe we should engage in endless self-flagellation, but rather than merely showing contrition for at least the tail end of the 14 years in office, doesn't there need to be an explanation as well? You can't just have leading Conservatives like yourself, or recently I heard it from Chris Philp, you're saying, sorry, we made some mistakes. It's got to be, why did we make those mistakes, right? And as you'll know, our outfit, Popular Conservatism, our kind of analysis is, sadly and wrongly, for 14 years, the Conservative government tried to control and drive the Blairite train. And you can't really direct a train. You're on tracks, right? You can either go faster or slower, but you can't really steer it. And in consequence, all of these failures are basically born of, no doubt there were individual errors as well, but are basically born of failing to change the governance structure of the United Kingdom so that Quangos have grown up everywhere, undermining Parliament. Some might even say we now have a Potemkin Parliament. With the bureaucracy running all affairs. We went for carbon net zero. We remained in ECHR. We retained the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act. We basically didn't fix the plumbing, right? And that's why things kept leaking. Do you think that is the right analysis of what went wrong? Again, there'll be individual foibles and errors of different prime ministers and cabinet ministers, no doubt. Mistakes happen. But underlying it all, we didn't fix the system.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I don't think that it's sufficient as an explanation. I think that the problem is even bigger than that, actually. It's that there was an order that has existed for a long time, at least since 1997, and some of its roots go back even further than that. And the governments of the period post-2010 were basically willing to go along with that order rather than take it on. And that is more than just the way in which the state operates, the civil service, the laws that were created by the Blair government, the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act, the Climate Change Act. It's also net zero as a proposition. It's the way in which we handled the planning system and sought to address the housing crisis. It's the way in which we teach our kids in school, or the way in which we approach institutions like our museums in this country, which I would argue have had a crisis of confidence and turned on our national identity with very damaging effects. It's certainly mass migration, which has grown up as an orthodoxy since 1997. I think Tony Blair was the founding father of mass migration, and other governments have failed to take it on entirely. The way I view our politics today is that order has failed. It's broken down. It's collapsed. And the men and women who supported it or went along with it are now essentially yesterday's people. And we're in an interregnum right now where the order has been demolished and we're waiting for the new one to rise up. We want to be the force of change. We want to be the people who shape that, who drive it forwards. And so it is akin to what happened in the late 1970s, where a set of policies that had existed for a long period of time had been demonstrated to fail, had left the country in a parlous state, and then there was just this period in which politics was stale, was broken, where the country was in stasis, and it was waiting for people and political parties to really grip the country, take it by the scruff of its neck, and deliver the change that was needed, create the new order. I think that's where we are today, and I want the Tory party to be the party which makes that change. But we have to acknowledge that for too long, Conservative governments went along with that order, even though it was obviously breaking down
on it, right? I mean,
it did.
There was so much. You can argue that we inherited a kind of regulatory state and a bureaucracy, but then 12 years into our reign, we think it's a good idea to bring in a football regulator, for example. We were moving more and more power in this direction, not at the speed that the Labour Party would have done, right? 14 years of Labour government would have been worse. But we kind of went with that grain rather than resisting it in any meaningful way I can really think of.
Yeah, that's right. There were exceptions to that. I would argue that the planning reforms, for example, that I proposed were an example of trying to do a really major supply side reform. Different, but akin to some of the ones that Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s that would have not just built more homes, but created economic growth and jobs and got the state out of a significant part of our life and economy. So there were efforts to push against the tide, but you're right to say that far too often the easy path was taken, which was to go along with the prevailing orthodoxy, even to double down on it, with very harmful effects. And we have to learn from those mistakes now and look to the future and say, how can we do something that is fundamentally different? And that's what I'm primarily interested in, because we've got to be the party of the future. That's what the public will ultimately be judging us on when we come to the next general election. And we've got to explain to the public and convince them that not only have we learnt the mistakes of the past, but that we have a plan to take the country forward, to arrest what I would argue is very clear economic and societal decline and put the country back on a firmer footing. And I think we can do that. I am an optimist because I think that the mistakes that we've made of a country are very serious ones in recent years, but they are fixable. And actually now we broadly know what those things are. We know what has gone wrong in this country, and I think we know how we can fix it. The key thing is to get people behind those things and get the country moving in the right direction.
Now, you've mentioned the kind of unusually competitive state of British politics, or the multi-party nature of it. And one unusual feature of that is competition on the centre-right. But you've also got, say, the rise of the Green Party and the Gaza independence on the hard left. Let's talk about Reform UK, because it seems to me that, any route back to power, the Conservative Party is going to have a good answer to what's caused this phenomenon. So my read of it at the last election, I guess the general election results sort of fell roughly as I expected, that we'd get absolutely, walloped, but would still come second in vote share and would form the official opposition in Parliament. And Reform UK might win 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 seats, but would be a long, long way behind us. And then as the Labour government was proven to be useless, I didn't expect that to happen this quickly, people would start drifting back, and those who'd voted Reform UK at the last general election because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the re-election of a Tory government would naturally drift back. That hasn't happened, has it? Farage and Reform UK have tapped into something way beyond what they were able to tap into at the general election, which of itself was an impressive result for an insurgent party. But as we're speaking today, latest opinion poll, Reform UK on 34%, Conservatives 15%. Now, that's slightly higher for them and slightly lower for us than the norm, but it's not completely out of whack. What have they tapped into that the Conservative Party has failed to tap into since Labour came to power?
Well, I understand why people are voting for reform. I understand why they're listening to Nigel Farage. There is a deep well of anger and frustration in the country right now, which is the product of a sustained period of poor economic growth. The social contract essentially being shredded for young people and for the middle classes right now, where people are being taxed to the hilt. They can't get good public services. They can't get on the housing ladder. A sense that petty lawlessness is out of control. Issues I've taken up lately, from fare dodging to tool theft to shoplifting, which people are often dismissed, but actually are a very significant. Standards seem to be dropping. People don't feel safe. Our streets aren't safe or clean anymore. Those basic things that you expect. A general lack of pride in the country. And obviously, immigration being totally out of control. Far, far too many people still coming in, despite the reforms that I eventually persuaded Rishi Sunak to do in the dying days of his government. And the small boats crisis actually escalating, which is the ultimate symbol of the failure of the state. Because a country without borders, to me, is just not a country at all. And a lot of people, particularly in Westminster, I think just did not appreciate the level of anger and frustration and disillusionment that there is in the country right now. And that is driving people to reform and to other parties as well. What the Conservative Party has to do is demonstrate to the public they actually understand that level of anger and frustration, and that we as a party have changed absolutely fundamentally. And unless we do that and do it quickly, then there's real danger. I do think this is an existential crisis for the Conservative Party. If it wants to survive and to prosper, because no political party has a divine right to exist. It may have existed for hundreds of years, may have served the country very well in the past, may have produced some of our greatest prime ministers, but there's no right for the Conservative Party to exist or to prosper. If we want it to, then we have to show that we've changed, that we understand the level of anger and frustration, and differentiate ourselves by having serious answers to those challenges that the country is facing right now. That is what the party's got to do, and it's got to do it fast, because there's competition for the first time.
Well, maybe I can take a question from Lindsay Sharrett, who says, what is the key thing the party needs to do to win back our core voter trust? So you say it needs to be demonstrated, but how? I mean, is this a series of speeches by shadow cabinet ministers? Is there some massive mea culpa? Does there need to be some battle within the Conservative Party that more radical Conservatives win and more established Conservatives lose? What is it that would demonstrate that, rather than it just willing it to be so, I guess, is what Lindsay's asking.
Well, I don't think it's more speeches. I think people are sick to death of politicians who are just doing speeches, being in Westminster. The attitude that I've certainly taken, I can only speak for myself, in recent months, is to try and do politics in a different way, and to appreciate that people have a very dim view of politicians, particularly from the Conservative Party and the Labour Party right now. So get out of Westminster, frankly, get out of a suit, take up the issues, the concerns that we all share as working people across the country, and get stuck in. One of the reasons why some of these videos that I've done have attracted a bit of interest, whether it's going around a car boot sale where tools have been nicked are being sold in plain sight, or fare dodging on the London Underground, is, I think, because it's taking up regular people's issues that we all are united on, that affect all of us in different ways, and showing that you're actually getting stuck in, trying to get something done, shaming the authorities to take action, trying to make the country a better place. And I think it's in that new and different style of politics that we can begin to regain people's trust and confidence. Because it's really by showing, not telling, that we can get the public to give us a hearing again, to listen to us once again in a way they clearly haven't been in the past, and in many respects they're not doing at the moment.
Let me put a kind of an historical theory of politics to you, which is a rather depressing one, I'm afraid, but it is also a bit of a stretch. Because a lot of people are saying now that the Conservative Party could go the way the Liberal Party went 100 years ago, which had not as long a history as the Conservative Party, but a highly impressive electoral record to date, and then almost within 10 years completely collapsed and became a fringe party. Now, often when that's looked back on, people sort of say, well, it's because Herbert Asquith and Lloyd George sort of fell out with each other and it became factionalised, and then they started running candidates against each other and the whole thing blew up. But I wonder whether that really does tell the whole story historically. It is true those two men fell out with each other, but that's because what had united the Liberal Party throughout the 19th century, which is basically support for empire, support for the emergent middle class, particularly with regard to extending the franchise, and support for free trade. These were the defining issues of the day, and the Liberals were united on that. As you start to get into the 1900s and the 1910s, the big issues become, should we support an emerging welfare state? Should we support conscription of men to fight a war? And suddenly the Liberal Party are divided on these issues, and they're the defining ones. So here's a worrying thought, that might it have been the case that over our lifetime broadly, that the Conservative Party was united around support for British national institutions, the monarchy, the police, the armed forces, robust opposition to communism and the Soviet Union, a broadly pro-business approach. You could argue whether it's purely free market, but sort of pro-capitalist. That was enough to sort of, and those were the big issues. And that's enough to keep, say, John Redwood and John Selwyn Gummer in the same party. Now, the big issues are you basically supportive of global institutions or sceptical of them? Brexit obviously being the first indication of that, but also ECHR. Do you believe climate change is the greatest threat facing mankind, or do you believe it is a lower priority than that and carbon net zero is too expensive? Where do you stand on wokery and what a woman is, for example? And it seems to me on these issues, the Conservative Party isn't united, that there were very different views on Brexit. There are very different views on ECHR and the Human Rights Act. There are very different views on climate change. How the hell do we link all this together? I mean, Lee Nadalangham asks, Robert, you talk a good game, but I know two people who have said that the Parliamentary Tory Party would never support what you say. So why should we bother listening to you? I trust that you believe what you say. But let's be honest, the likes of you, Suella, Rees-Mogg, are now an ever-increasing minority in the Conservative Party. I don't know whether that's true or not. My broader point was, are there just now too many dividing issues within the party to unite? Reform are united on these points. Labour are united on these points. The Conservatives are not.
Well, I've always said that a political party can be a broad church, but it's got to have a common creed. It's got to have some kind of religion at the heart of it. And the Tory party hasn't had that in recent years. It has had too diverse opinions, which has meant that you've left the public completely confused. What does this thing actually stand for? And there's been far too many times I've been on the doorstep and people have said to me, I don't know the difference between you and the Lib Dems and the Labour Party. Enough. The Tory party has got to be very clear what it stands for. And with the greatest respect, that means that there might be some people who conclude this isn't the right party for them. And I mean no disrespect to those individuals. Just the party's got to believe in something. It's got to be clear what it stands for, so the public aren't left confused. I want the party to stand for, broadly speaking, what you've just described: strong borders, tough on crime, a pro-business and enterprise approach, a small state that actually works, pride, common sense and basic biology on some of those key issues. I think that is actually a very unifying agenda. I don't think it's left or right. I think it is the common ground, not just in the party, but in the country, which is what really matters, and that we can unite the vast majority of Conservatives around that. That is what has to happen in the years ahead if we're going to get a hearing again from the British public. I don't think actually the other parties are nearly as united as you suggest. When I look across the aisle at the Labour Party, I think there are hugely divergent views within the party. You see on some of the issues we've got at the moment, like welfare and Gaza. I actually think within reform there are some significant areas of difference. I don't actually understand exactly what reform stands for when it talks about the economy. One minute they seem very keen on nationalising industries, the other day they're talking about creating a special visa for attracting wealthy individuals to come to the UK. You know, those are quite different visions of the economy. One minute Nigel Farage is saying that he wants a smaller state and lower taxes. The next minute he's saying that he's going to hand thousands of pounds out to people for their third, fourth, fifth child. Well, in the place that I represent, which is a working class town in North Nottinghamshire, parents who are making responsible decisions, I think, would be very surprised to hear Nigel saying that he wants to spend hundreds of millions of pounds, perhaps billions of pounds on extra benefits, on welfare payments, just at a time that we want to have the welfare bill brought down, got under control. It's rising to £100 billion a year. That's not sensible. That's not the right policy. So I don't think the other parties are nearly as united ideologically as you suggest. But you are right to say The Tory party has been confused. The public are confused as a result. We've got to be very clear what we stand for, and that is an essential element of rebuilding trust and confidence.
I'm rather with you on that. Our last pop conversation was with Lee Anderson, and I did say to Lee that while I was very fond of both him and Nigel Farage, I was a bit worried that they were both slightly pinko lefties, particularly on economic policy. But let's look forward to some policies and changes that need to be made. And at the top of the show, I highlighted, the growth of the Quango state. One of your very successful campaigns was exposing the horrific advice issued by the Sentencing Guidance Council. But in my mind, worse still than that, with the apparent, at least to my eyes, lack of knowledge of the Justice Secretary or beyond her powers. It wasn't just that some Quango had come up with some weird ideas. These were going to be railed through unless there was, and I suspect would have been, had it not been for your campaign against it. Let's roll forward and suppose everything falls into place and we win the July 2029 general election with a handsome majority. What are the first key things that you think the Conservative government would need to set about doing? Because it's my assertion that unless we start by changing the infrastructure, then any efforts to lower regulation or cut taxes or get spending under control, I wouldn't say are entirely fruitless, but are a bit like an exercise in pushing water uphill. Whereas if you reset the machinery, start getting rid of these Quangos, then you've got a much better chance a year or two later to actually execute a Conservative agenda. So to my mind, I think there are 444 Quangos in Britain, there or thereabouts at least. I wish it was 666 rather than 444. I mean, shouldn't we just methodically go through them, decide whether we're going to scrap them? I suppose there are some that could be privatised. I don't think, perhaps the Arts Council could stand on its own 2 feet through charitable donations. And then some which would, if you like, be fully nationalised. That's, say, brought fully within ministerial control. I appreciate they're public bodies, but fully within ministerial control. So if you're the Justice Secretary and you want advice from some experts, and they sit in room 106 and they're called the Sentencing Guidance Council, fine by me. But they're advising you as the Justice Secretary. They're not some different offshoot. We should basically get down to zero Quango, shouldn't we? It's either in the governmental department or it's scrapped or it's privatised.
Well, the Sentencing Council is a good example because that is a Gordon Brown invention, a Quango, which was able to make actually very profound decisions like the one they were proposing, which was going to create a more lenient route through the justice system, depending on the colour of your skin, the faith that you abide by. Something that I fundamentally disagree with is the opposite of my own conception of the rule of law, which is about equality of treatment before the law, not equality of outcome. And yet, not only did the Justice Secretary not know about this, which I would argue is due to her incompetence, that she wasn't following what was going on in her own department, but when she did discover it, because we told her, she wasn't able to change it. And she had to plead with the Sentencing Council.
Well, she
do
wrote a very stiff letter.
She wrote a letter. She met them. They said no. They told her to,
Get
stuffed. And she was then humiliated and reduced to piloting emergency legislation through Parliament to overturn the sentencing guidelines of a Sentencing Council, which is a Quango that sits in her own department. Ludicrous. And that cannot continue. We've got to change that. There's a broader issue than just that one Quango. Quangos, were created in the sort of Thatcher government era as a mechanism to bring in private sector experience, to improve the quality of these organisations, and has obviously been twisted and contorted out of all recognition so that Margaret Thatcher would turn in her grave as she could see what they've become today. Exactly as you say, I think there is a task for the Conservative Party and the centre-right more generally to work methodically through each of these organisations and say, which one is actually serving its original intent? And maybe there are some. Very few, I would suggest. Some could be privatised, some could be scrapped altogether because they just simply don't perform any useful task, or whatever they're doing is more harm than good. Others, probably the majority, should be brought back into government departments under direct ministerial control, so we return to a world in which ministers are making decisions accountable to Parliament, ultimately accountable to the public. And it would save money, it would be far more democratic, and it would do what I think the public are craving for right now, which is help us to actually get stuff done.
Yeah.
Because the country is in such a mess right now that, if we were lucky enough to get back into government after the next general election, we've got to change things and not just be technocrats, but be people who are doing things in the national interest. And that requires ministers to be able to pull levers and something actually happens as a result of it. And that's what I want us to see. And coupled with that is we've got to work through this network of laws that were created after or during the Blair administration, like the Equalities Act, the Climate Change Act, the Human Rights Act. And I've proposed, and others seem to support this, the creation of some kind of Great Repeal Act, whereby as one of the first acts of an incoming government, we again say which of these laws are actually working in the interest of the British public, which need to be amended, and which need to be scrapped altogether. And these are very serious pieces of work, which is why I do agree with Kemi that we've got to use this time wisely that we've got in opposition to think very, very carefully and methodically about each of these things so that we're ready to go on day one when we come into office and bring forward some legislation to fundamentally reform the civil service, the working of the state, the laws that hold up and frustrate democratic government from having the impact that it needs. And this feels to me so, so important now because you've had a Conservative government, particularly in its last few years, which did not do what was necessary, followed in succession by a Labour government that seems to be failing far more than we could even have imagined. So the level of anger and frustration amongst the public is so profound. If whatever comes next fails again, then I worry for our politics altogether because I think people would just feel that democratic policy is not working. What is the point in voting, in supporting political parties, in hoping that change is possible if government after government just lets down the British public, never gets anything done, doesn't turn the ship around?
So on your Great Repeal Act, and appreciate the Conservative Party is methodically working through these things, and you might argue this is a comparative advantage over reform. Reform, very clear we're going to leave the ECHR and scrap the Human Rights Act. Conservative Party seems to be leaning now in that direction, but wants to work out exactly how we do it. And there are huge technical questions. The Good Friday Agreement, for example, there would have to be a workaround there. So I get that. But in your rough mind on this Great Repeal Act, give me some indications of what Robert Jenrick would be sitting around the cabinet table saying should be put in it. Repeal the Human Rights Act in entirety, repeal the Equality Act in entirety. Would those be a couple of things you'd ask for? Give me the sketch of it, even though I completely agree with you that a responsible government needs to do a hell of a lot of rather technical work around it and exactly how you do it and how it interfaces with other agreements. But give me the headlines.
Well, you know my views. They're very well reported. I've spoken at length about the ECHR, the very damaging effect that I believe it's having, not just on immigration, but on criminal justice, our inability to get rid of dangerous people from our country, the effect that it may have in the years ahead on other important issues like net zero. You saw this ludicrous decision a year ago where the court in Strasbourg overturned a democratic referendum in Switzerland on climate policy. So it is getting worse. I don't believe it's reformable. I mean, you may have seen a group of European countries wrote to the Council of Europe asking whether a reform process could start, including Giorgia Meloni from Italy. And the Secretary General of the Council of Europe wrote back to them saying,
not really.
Basically, get lost.
Yeah.
I mean, showing absolute disregard for leaders of democratically like Giorgia Meloni, really significant figures within Europe. So I don't think reform's going to work. I think that's a complete waste of time.
And so the Human Rights Act's got to go with it, right? There's no point in leaving the ECHR and retaining the Human Rights Act, which basically encodes this into English law, right?
Yeah, that is my view. I've said that in the past. But I do think that it is right that the Tory party thinks very carefully about how this is all done in practice, because these are not simple questions.
Sure.
I mean, they're ones that I've been thinking about for a long time, and I saw them firsthand as a minister in multiple government departments. That forged my own views. But it's not unreasonable for the party to think this through very carefully so that we can present to the British public a very clear and credible plan as to how we do this. And the same goes for the Climate Change Act, the Equalities Act, other pieces of legislation whereby I think there's a strong case for outright repeal, but there are a lot of things at stake here, and so it's important that the party gets this right. And that's why Kemi has initiated this process. With respect to the ECHR, she's asked one of the most respected Conservative lawyers, Lord Wolfson, person I know very well, have the highest regard for, to work through these challenges.
Okay. Anne-Marie Cooper asks, did you read the excellent article by Kamal Ahmed interviewing Dominic Cummings in the Daily Telegraph? Cummings seems to be supportive of PopCon goals and much of what Reform stands for. She asked what the relationship between the Conservative Party and Cummings is now. I don't know how you could necessarily answer that, but what's your view of his disruptor approach and his recent interventions in public debate? Are you cheering him on and saying, yeah, that's what we should have done? We've got to rip up some trees, not shilly-shally around. Are you persuaded by his broad argument about what's needed to fix Britain?
Well, look, where I agree with him is I think the country's in a mess. I think this is a moment akin to the 1970s where there's like an inflection point, isn't it? The country just can continue to sort of rub along, try to manage decline. And eventually the rubber will hit the road, frankly, on that anyway, because I think we've passed the point where in which you can just do that year after year. I think there's a high likelihood we'll reach a debt crisis if you continue going down that road, in which the markets just say, enough, stop borrowing so much money, stop spending so much money. You have no growth strategy as a country. So I don't even think that as try and manage decline strategy is going to end well, and that could end very badly. But obviously, I stand for, no, let's now try and grip the country. Let's turn this around. And that means all the things we've been talking about. It means, how are we going to get growth going again in this country? How are we going to have cheap and reliable energy? How do we get homes built so that we can get some growth going and help young people on to the housing ladder? It means a capped system of migration as low as possible to give the country breathing space and actually try and resolve some of the challenges that come as a result of mass migration. It means fundamentally changing our human rights laws so that we stop the boats once and for all and restore public trust and confidence. I think the public are yearning for a party which is going to actually grip the country. And so in that sense, then, yeah, absolutely. I'm on the side of people who want radical change in the country right now.
Thomas Gordon is our top voted question, I think, at the moment. Blair had hardwired so many remote, unelected bureaucratic committees and quangos into the running of the UK. He wants to see a future government untangle it. But I want to take that one step further, going straight to the heart of your portfolio, Robert, as Shadow Justice Secretary. The judicial system in Britain is now falling into disrepute, isn't it? I mean, I sort of said at the top of the show that back in the day, Conservatives would have been instinctively pro-monarchy, pro-police, pro-the judiciary. What on earth is going wrong in our judicial system, which on the face of it, at least on the criminal sanction side, are issuing punishments which I think go well beyond two-tier justice, just are irreconcilable. You know, one of your many viral videos, you highlight some of the sentences given to those involved in the rape gangs. It's 4 years here, 5 years there, 9 years here. I mean, some of them are getting an equivalent sentence to Lucy Connolly for putting out a tweet. What on earth is going wrong here? And I don't want to, it's very difficult to compare apples and pears, and I'm not suggesting that sort of every judge has now become politicised, but it looks and feels as if there is one rule for one and one for another, and that there is politics at play now in sentencing. How has this happened, and how does Justice Secretary Jenrick in 2029 fix that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I'd say. Firstly, there is such inconsistency in the way in which sentencing is done in this country right now that is massively corrosive to public trust and confidence. And I see this every day now, where you see somebody who has 100,000 child sexual abuse images on their computer, and the judge says, I'm going to give you a second chance. You're not going to jail. Mm-hmm. There was somebody in the papers I read this morning who has been convicted of attempted rape, a counsellor. This is from some years ago. It's an historic sexual offence. Attempted rape, a really appalling incident, actually. The details are truly horrific. He's not gone to jail.
It's unbelievable.
And then you have somebody for a tweet of previous good character sent to prison.
For 31 months.
For 31 months. And not so far even allowed out early when all these other people are being released early. the public look at this and think, what the hell is going on in our criminal justice system? Well, I think the way in which the system is set up is completely wrong. So these sentences that are being passed down are far, far too lenient in many cases.
And far too harsh in others.
And then far too harsh in others. So sentencing requires a complete overhaul to restore common sense. And I'm afraid it will mean that some people will go to prison for longer. And that means we've got to build more prisons. It means we've got to get the foreign offenders out of our prisons and out of our country so we can create capacity to do this. You know, I don't subscribe to the David Gauke sort of fashionable liberal attitude that no one should be going to prison for so-called short sentences. I think if you're a prolific shoplifter, you should go to prison. Get these people off our streets for punishment and as a matter of public protection. People say, oh, well, prisons don't turn people around. Well, yes, we should invest in education and rehabilitation within prisons.
But meanwhile,
keep these people off our streets. Yeah. And if you think, well, short sentences don't work, well, maybe have longer sentences then, frankly. But there's another point, which is about the judiciary itself. And this is something that most people have shied away from, you know, and I've been criticised for talking about it, probably because almost nobody in a position like myself in the recent past has been willing to say this. But our country has had a judiciary for a very long time that is amongst the most revered in the world for its quality and for its impartiality. But we are now seeing some examples where I think it is hard to explain other than to say that there is creeping, there is a creeping sense of politicization within the judiciary.
And mediocrity, probably.
Well, even my, arch critic, Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, has himself said that there are bad decisions being made. For example, in some of the lower tier immigration tribunals where judges are making just poor decisions, particularly in the application of the ECHR. And we've come across a number of judges, particularly in immigration tribunals, where, of course, it's very hard in practice to say conclusively whether people have applied their personal political views in coming to a judgment. You can never prove that. But what you can show is that they have done things in their private life, like tweeted, or been trustees of charities or organisations, which have brought them into the political sphere and therefore brought the judiciary into disrepute. I want to change that. I think we've got to be much more careful about how we're appointing judges. There is a Quango, the Judicial Appointments Commission, which is led by somebody incidentally who's been forced to resign from their other job because they were essentially disgraced. This is wrong. We were able just
the solution here is to go back to the Lord Chancellor and the Lords.
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case.
This is David Starkey.
I think there's a very strong case for
just reset it.
The Lord Chancellor having a much more active role in the appointment of judges. Not so they're politicised, quite the opposite, so that they are depoliticised. And you can assure that these individuals are being appointed of the highest calibre, where there's absolutely no evidence that they are political. And where judges do enter the political sphere, it's right that they're called out. Everyone in public life should be open to scrutiny and accountability, and that includes judges. And I'm doing that, and I think it's a very important role.
To get the example of that, there's so many things that have caused me upset, shock, and I've been appalled at in the last year by the way our country operates. Lady Chief Justice, I can't remember her surname now, but there was and I'll get some of these details wrong, but you'll know it. There was a Prime Minister's questions between Kemi and Starmer. There was a debate about a particular asylum application, I think, that had been granted to a non-Ukrainian family under Ukrainian rules. This are the details of it. Anyway, the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister have a to and fro about this, and you can argue about which of them is right or wrong. I think that they didn't actually disagree very much. Then a judge intercedes, not to say that they got a particular piece of law wrong, but to say it was inappropriate for them to be debating this over the dispatch box of our sovereign parliament.
Yeah, I thought that was disgraceful. As you say, the case was a completely mad one, where we created the Ukraine scheme for perfectly understandable reasons for Ukrainians, and then a judge somehow managed to distort that to allow Gazans to come to the UK. Completely ludicrous situation. But whatever the rights or wrongs, or whatever side of that argument you're on, it must be right that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition can discuss whether or not that judgment was correct, what the consequences of that were going to be, and whether or not we should change the law if necessary to fix whatever problem had arisen. And that the Lady Chief Justice decided to say, no, you're not allowed to stray into this sphere. Wrong, absolutely wrong, and showed poor judgment on her part.
We've only got about 10 minutes left, but I want to talk a bit about your political journey. And, I suppose an uncharitable person would say, well, not necessarily uncharitable, but that the Robert Jenrick of 2025 is a very different political creature to the Robert Jenrick of, say, 2010. I rather commend this, by the way. I mean, if you have been on a political journey, it's not been as long and winding as my own, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So I don't object to it at all. And whenever politicians are pointed at and say, well, he's had a Damascene conversion, I don't really see that as cynical. I mean, St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus was at least sincere, right? Nobody doubts that. But and certainly a lot of our people in PopCon, and I know lots of them said to me, look, I really like Robert Jenrick, but is he the real deal? Why has he changed his mind or his emphasis? Tell us a little about that. And, as I say, I think it's always a good thing to change one's mind in the light of experience and unfolding facts. It's not a criticism in my view. I wish more politicians would do it rather than just be continually wrong. But would you agree with that? I mean, actually, one of our somebody asked, happy 9th Brexit Day. If the referendum was taking place today, would you now vote leave? Jonathan Lang says, happy 9th Brexit Day, Robert. Would Mr. Jenrick vote for Brexit if it was indeed today? That would be one.
Yeah, well, I certainly would do.
But,
there's lots of people whose views have evolved over time. I mean, Bill Cash told me the other day that I was surprised about that he'd voted to stay in the European community.
Well, he voted for the Maastricht Treaty.
Exactly. So there's definitely people who surprise you like that. Look, I always think this is a bit overstated. I didn't join the Tory party in 2010 under David Cameron. I joined the Tory party in 1997 in Wolverhampton, and there weren't many Conservatives in Wolverhampton in 1997. There certainly weren't many people who would be described as Cameroons back then. And even when I first stood for Parliament, which was when David Cameron was the Prime Minister, the Tory party then was a party which was trying to control migration. Not perfectly, but a hell of a lot better than it did later on in office. It certainly wasn't a Tory party that wanted to see 1 million people enter the country every year. It was a Tory party that was trying to reduce the size of the state with some success. Making some quite difficult decisions. I mean, look at the size of the civil service that was reduced and then allowed to spiral later on. I think a lot of the big problems of the Tory party came about in the recent years when the ministers at the time made absolutely catastrophic decisions, like to create the points-based immigration system, for example. But I tend to think that my own politics are rooted in the kind of places that I grew up in. I grew up in Wolverhampton in the West Midlands. I now represent somewhere that's not totally different in the East Midlands, small town in Newark. My parents are both from working class backgrounds in Manchester and Liverpool, small business people. Those are my people.
Did the Home Office radicalise you? Did being at the Home Office, I think once you've seen the nature of the beast, did you actually start to think this system can't work, doesn't work, needs change?
Yeah, it did sharpen my views. I think John Hayes likes to say I was radicalised by the facts, and that there's some truth in that. But what I saw in the Home Office was an absolute disgrace. It was complete breakdown of our borders, and I made an effort to go and talk to people who that was actually affecting. The people who live in the estate at the cliffs of Dover, who'd met asylum seekers, legal migrants who'd broken into the country and then turned up in their gardens or their kitchens. People who were completely understandably angry about asylum hotels in Peterborough and prestigious hotels that they'd had their golden wedding anniversary in or got married in, and yet were now being taken over by asylum seekers. And it left me with a sense that the state is broken, that many politicians and much of the media had shown complete disdain for people's views and had no idea of the practical, real-world effects of these policies on ordinary people across our country, and that things had to change. They absolutely had to change. And ultimately, obviously, I fought to change things with a degree of success. I mean, the small boat crossings fell by a third when I was the minister with Suella, and they've risen since dramatically. We managed eventually to persuade Rishi to put in place changes to the legal migration system that, as you can see, are starting to have some effect. But none of this was enough. And I got very, very angry that I felt I had an answer on both legal and illegal migration. I knew how to stop the boats. I knew how to get legal migration down to where it needs to be. And leaders were just not willing to do it. And even worse than that, they were talking the talk. We'll stop the boats, now Starmer, we'll smash the gangs. They knew full well that their policies were never going to have the impact that they said they were going to. In fact, they were sticking two fingers up, really, to the British public, laughing at them behind the scenes. And I wasn't willing to go along with that. And so that did radicalise me. I felt that if I was ever lucky enough to be in office again, in whatever capacity, I was never willing to do that. I want to be a politician who actually says what I think, has an agenda, stands for something, and then if we're lucky enough to be in office, actually does it. And that is what people, I think, want right now from politicians.
And do you think, we touched on this a little earlier, that the wider Conservative Party, I mean, in part, your 120 colleagues in the House of Commons, but the grassroots Conservative Party, councillors up and down the land, do you think they're really up for that challenge? I mean, let me give you another example. I don't know how it will pan out, but Reform going through their councils and applying what they say is an Elon Musk sort of UK Doge style approach. We're going to root out every last piece of fraud, waste and frivolity. Why haven't Conservative councils been doing that for the last 10 or 15 years? I mean, well, perhaps you'll tell me
some
they
have. I mean,
some have.
Look at some of the great councils that we sadly, some of them we don't control anymore, like Westminster and Wandsworth, that managed to keep council tax very low, deliver good public services, were absolute, they were the sort of guiding lights of what good public service delivery could be.
Yeah, I didn't want to focus just on the... Do you broadly think the Conservative Party is now up for being a party of radical change rather than actually conserving? I mean, in order to conserve Britain, we're now going to have to radically change the way it's governed, right?
Yeah, I think the party will have to be a party of change because the situation we find ourselves in demands it. The country is in such a mess, and those challenges are only going to deepen in the years ahead. And Keir Starmer is not someone who is going to fix this problem. He's just temperamentally not suited to it. He is a tinkerer. He's someone who is just doing small things around the edges. Look at like the welfare reforms that he's pursuing, and may even backtrack on those. But they're going to stop the welfare bill from rising to I think £103 billion. And reduced to £98 billion. This is trivial. Yeah. This is absolutely trivial. It fundamentally misunderstands the state of affairs. The country has to be turned around, and that is going to require a party that really steps up and brings forward radical solutions to the big challenges that we face. And I want that to be the Tory party. I think there's a number of things that divide us in politics today, but one of the big divides is between those people who see that the country is in economic and societal decline, but are basically willing to go along with it because they're too worried about respectability, how they're perceived, what their future might hold on the international circuit, whether they'll get invited to dinner parties in North London. Yeah. And those people who see that the country is in economic and societal decline, love this country, do not care what North London lawyers think about them, whether they'll be invited to Davos, international sort of lawyers think about them, want to grip the country and turn it around. And there's a lot of energy on the centre-right from people who share that belief. I want the Tory party to be that party, a party of radical change that's setting out to save the country.
And my last question to you, Robert, is do you think we need to take a rather more ecumenical approach to Reform UK, reach out to them somewhat, try and build alliances with them. Look, we're miles away from an election, so God knows what the polls would be. God knows what an electoral alliance might look like. But I would generally put the Reform UK people in this same category of being despairing about where the country has got to, but optimistic it can be fixed. That's where you and I would sit, even though we're members of the Tory party. We should try and be building bridges, at least, with these guys, right?
Well, look, I take a general attitude of trying to have good relations with anyone on the centre-right who I can. And, that's, I have friends in Reform. I understand why people are voting Reform. I think Reform is a symptom of the Tory party's failure to deliver and to do what it said it was going to do. The best attitude to me is, I don't disparage people who vote Reform. Why would we? We want these people to come back to us, don't we? We want the Tory party to
Kemi
be
said she
the
was
natural
glad that people
home.
were leaving and joining because they're not Conservatives. I mean, that seemed to me an odd.
Well,
maybe that was taken out of context.
I think that may have been taken out of context. Like, I want to get those people to come back to us.
Quite.
I want to get them. In fact, there's no future for the Tory party unless we can get some or all of the millions of people that we've lost to come back home to us and to see us as a natural home for them and their friends and like-minded people in this country. That's what I think our aim should be in the years ahead. Have decent relations with them, but be our own party. We are the Conservative Party. We're different to Reform, and we have a different heritage. But I want people to feel comfortable coming back home to us, and that should be the priority, alongside just being better than Reform every single day. When we hold Labour to account, when we hold the Lib Dems to account, when we bring forward good policies in the months and years ahead, prove to the public that we deserve their trust and their confidence. And I think we can do that. I hope in my own small way that I've shown that with some of these campaigns that I fought, like on two-tier justice, that has shown people, we saw a problem. We had the courage to raise it on the agenda, and we got change. We got Labour to change their tune and come back and do something differently. That is how we demonstrate that we are better than Reform and that we are the people that the public should put their confidence in.
Rob, before I thank you, thanks to all of our audience for joining us. We've had hundreds of you signing up to join us live for this. I'm sorry I could only get through a few of your questions. If you're watching us on Catch Up and you would like to join live for these sort of discussions in future, make sure you go to popularconservatism.com and sign up for our newsletter. You'll get all of the notifications. Thanks to all of you who've joined us and made PopCon a great success over the last year or so. This is our last Pop Conversation before summer recess, but fear not, we'll be back on the other side of the summer with more great conversations. But most of all, my thanks to you, Rob. Thanks for a brilliant
hour.
Thanks,
Mark. It's been good to be with you.
More power to your elbow. Thanks so much.
Thank you.